And we are live.
Oh my goodness.
So, this is episode 1 of the Melbourne Athletic Development Podcast. Obviously, for some of you who would know who we are, I'm John Nicolosi and this is Jack Williams, and we're the people that run Melbourne Athletic Development. We are physios by background. Both have backgrounds also in strength and conditioning and coaching. Jack has a background in yoga. But more than anything, actually, we want to share some of the interesting areas that we've been exploring. We're really interested in education. We're really interested in sharing ideas, getting our asses kicked when it comes to learning new things. So this is the start, I think. What are you looking forward to with this, Jack? Like, why are we doing this, actually?
Well, I think all this will just be a recording of conversations that we typically have anyway.
Well, I think that's how we wanted to start it, wasn't it, really?
Absolutely.
Just some of the conversations we've been having for a long time. And I think maybe it's our own echo chamber of us just talking about topics that we like. But I think this probably provides the opportunity for us to explore some areas that maybe don't get spoken about in the way that we want to speak about them.
And also talking about stuff in a much more casual setting, because any of you who follow us, we already put up content with regards to like blog posts or short recordings that I do each week on articles I'm reviewing. We have core stuff that we teach, but the reality is, particularly nowadays, a good way to actually absorb and share information is through podcasting. And it was only about a week ago that someone recommended that we do this. And we thought, you know what?
Thank you to that person. Someone on Instagram actually just said, these blog posts, we quite like them. Have you ever thought about discussing these topics in a podcast? And I thought to myself, actually, I don't mind that idea. I might talk to Jack about it. So I think, we're pretty grateful for that. I think there's a number of motivations, as we've said, but I think one of the things is we want to discuss ideas. We want to challenge both ourselves and our guests. So we've got a heap of really cool guests lined up. And one of the things that I think we really are trying to do more than anything is highlight the really cool people that we get to interact with in this setting. We're very fortunate, I would say, Jack, that we get to communicate and have really good discussions with some really, really interesting, intelligent, creative people who have really enhanced our our understanding and our ability to apply to our practice. But they come from all walks of life, and I think that's probably the most interesting thing. And a lot of them, some of them start out as patients. They become people that in some ways even become friends and people that we confide in professionally. And some of the other guests, I think colleagues and people that we've met along the sort of journey. But I'm really looking forward to that more than anything.
Yeah. And I think with that too, it gives us an opportunity to have conversations with people outside, say, the physiotherapy realm, to really help understand what's influenced our approach clinically and give an opportunity to actually share that information with other people. Because I think there's an opportunity to learn a lot more and expand your thought process and what you do clinically when you start to branch out outside the typical area.
Let's open the discussion on that then. What do you mean by that? Like, why do you think that there's an opportunity to expand it? Like, I think one of the big things that both you and I have spoken about so often, and people are probably so sick to death when they come into, this space, about you can learn much more, from other areas. And I think probably one of the things that spawned this for us was the book by David Epstein, Range. I think both of us kind of really enjoyed that book, and it started making us think more and more about the breadth. And, I think in the book he talks about the idea of a lot of specialists in whatever area, whether that's, engineering, science, medical, they're 100 foot deep, but, about 1 centimeter wide. And I think you and I both kind of like to attach the idea of creating more breadth. Am I sort of interpreting that right?
Yeah, I think so. And there's two ways to look at it, because part of it is looking at different topics or areas and how that can influence what you do clinically. I think the other big thing, though, too, is to acknowledge that our profession has strengths and limitations like every other profession.
Well, I think, this week, as part of the preparation for this, I started talking to a few of the people that come in here who come from different professions, lawyers, someone who's got an IT background. And they were kind of like, it was really interesting talking to them about like, what process do you go through with decision making, or how do you arrive at an argument? Say, like we have a barrister that we're gonna ask to come on this podcast. And the questions I was asking, like, how do you formulate your arguments? How do you gather the information? And that to me was interesting because it's understanding how he goes about his process, I think will heavily inform maybe the way we approach problems. And going forward, like I think it's, we'll try and discuss this more with people, and in much greater depth than what we can because it's their area, but really sort of trying to build on some of those things so that practitioners can get more out of what they do clinically. Yeah,
it's about having those conversations or reading content where you go, oh, I've actually never thought of it that way. Because the issue we have, and to be honest, you and I have this problem when we have conversations with ourselves, is we can also or support our own biases. And we always need to challenge our own.
Yeah, confirmation biases.
Absolutely.
I feel like I'm so guilty that you go looking for the information you want.
Yeah, exactly. And that sort of expands then to like, the environment that we work in. I think you see that even at another level when you think about our profession, where if you're only talking to, say, physiotherapists, there is a certain method or fad that is used in our profession at this current point in time. So if you talk to other physiotherapists, you know typically what they're going to say. So the only opportunity to be able to expand your own knowledge or at least challenge your own beliefs is to actually go outside the conventional methods of how you think.
Well, I think he talks about that a lot. And I think there was a really cool example in that book where he's saying how, the guy who came up with this solution for removing oil from the ocean from an oil spill came from him doing, and he's an engineer and scientist, but it didn't come from his understanding of chemistry or, how to put that together. It came from him working with some guys that were in concreting. And the use of that, like they have like a wand, basically. It's like a vibration wand or something.
Yeah.
And it breaks up the sludge so that it becomes,
less viscous.
And then you can actually remove it rather than like these big, groupings of oil.
Yeah.
And vice versa. Like, so it just made it easy to remove. But that's quite interesting that like those insights, that sparks of knowledge and leaps of improvement in clinical practice or in what we do often don't come from where you think they're going to come from.
Yeah.
And I think that idea of experimentation is something we're really interested in and exploring.
Well, and that's it. I mean, ultimately, all of the ideas that we come up with is more from the fact that when we do it clinically or we try something clinically, we go, oh, that didn't work, or okay, that did work. That's interesting. We need to look at that further. Yeah,
I think there's so many, and I know there's so many good clinicians out there who think like us. That they're trying things all the time and they're sort of expanding on their knowledge. I think that's one of the fun things about the profession in many respects is you do get to experiment at times with how you input an intervention.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing that reflects how we approach it, because it's probably reflective of the whole healthcare industry, where it can be very protocol driven. And it would be lovely if that was the case, if there was this one size fits all approach. And I know a lot of people like to follow that approach because it's much easier to follow a particular recipe. But I find that the more you can actually think independently and think laterally, you find solutions to unique problems.
Okay, so we're talking a little bit in circles, at a more philosophical sense. For people who are listening to this and go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, what do you reckon, like, what have you found useful? Because I think there's a number of different resources. And, for those who don't know, Jack's a bit of, he's very resource savvy. He's got folders and folders and folders and folders of articles that he's looked at and referenced and read. And he's
to John's anger.
well, not to my anger, to my disappointment and my poor organizational skills.
Or when you're going, which folder do you put it in, Jack?
I can't seem to work out how to put something in a folder. But I think more than anything, like if someone's interested in this kind of stuff, where do they go? Because I think sometimes there's conversations we've had, like, as some of people who follow what we do, we recently started putting up some content online for courses, and we ran a practical session, and some of the topics that we even introduced in that, I still feel like people, some of them got it, and then others were like still sort of traversing the space. Like, if people are interested in like really expanding how they view healthcare and stuff, like, where do they go? Like, you're better at this than me, because I think my knowledge is probably more an eclectic mix of just like all the things that I've seen, but I think you're a bit more organized than I am.
I mean, that's a difficult question to answer. I think it's hard to answer because I even think for ourselves, we're still on this journey. Like, I see this as a process even for myself. Like, I don't think...
Actually, this is an interesting thing for us to ask each other. Like, where did this start for us, actually? Where do you think these paths... Because we're probably 4 or 5 years down the road now of like this similar pathway of like exploring something. Where do you think this started?
Well, for me personally, it actually started back at university.
Yeah. Okay.
And it actually started back then going...
What the fuck is going on?
Basically, like, I remember studying physiotherapy and being quite disappointed with what we were being taught and how we were being taught.
Well, actually, I'm hoping to get him on, but I'm going to ask him if he remembers this. One of my tutors was a fantastic guy, fantastic researcher named Adam Bryant. I know that you're close with Adam as well at a research level. And I remember we used to do these. And for those people who study physio or whatever and have gone through, those PBLs, problem-based learnings. And I remember I used to try and take the absolute piss out of them by finding whatever contrary evidence I could just to annoy everyone. And I do remember, and Adam, I think, found it quite funny, but I'm going to ask him if he remembers this when we get him on. He's definitely a guest that I think would be super helpful to a lot of our listeners, or hopeful listeners. I remember we were doing a problem-based learning problem around low back pain and, this idea of non-specific low back pain. And I remember I thought, okay, well, how can I approach this a little bit from the side? And I found all this research showed that, like, commonly a lot of low back pain may be caused by systemic problems. And one of the areas that I found interesting there was that actually there may be, in some cases, like, there's a bacterial cause for the development of discogenic pain. I shared this paper was showing that one was like antibacterial, medications had an effect. And the other one that I found, which I found really interesting, which buys into that sort of pain and psychological component, and hopefully we can get, because it's definitely not my area of knowledge, or at least depth of, is pain science, but was the antidepressants had a stronger effect on back pain as like a number of other interventions. And I think Adam really liked that because he was like, okay, this kid's kind of thinking a bit laterally. And I was doing it to be a smart ass as always. But
really? You?
Yeah. But I think that curiosity, I think, is something that, maybe it did start back then, didn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I had times thinking, do I actually want to do this?
Oh, yeah, I think we all did.
I probably had those over the years as well. But that's really where it started for me. And I remember actually feeling quite lost initially when I graduated, going, all right, what do I do? Like, am I interested in this profession? Like, what is my own philosophy that I want to apply clinically? It's actually interesting. It makes me think about your first question of where do you start? I think one of the big issues we have is we don't have any framework to start with of thinking, well, how do we approach a problem? Yeah. And like this, like, it's so far we've had much more of a philosophical discussion, but it is a philosophical discussion. I think before you can actually talk about content related to, this article or, looking at principles around exercise science, whatever it may be, it's really useful to think about, well, how do we address problems? And we have to be more specific in thinking about how do we address problems when we think about the human system.
Well, it reminds me, like, I started doing a little bit of work looking at this, and, like the philosophy of science. Like, what is science? How does it, how does it develop? What are the areas that are, and like, how do you even gain knowledge? And I came to a discussion that has been written about in a few books. Excuse me. And there's a classic argument, between Popper and Kuhn, and it's like this argument about how science actually develops, and the discussion is, this was I think it was in the 60s or 70s, the argument that went down. I can look it up actually if I want to find the exact date, but they had a debate, and basically it came out that, Kuhn's like ideas were probably more similar to what actually happens, and it's about like, how there's gradual changes and slowly there's like paradigm shifts that occur, and it's in incremental sense, and there's a lot of like day-to-day science that goes on, whereas Karl Popper, the philosopher, had this idea of, that there were these big leaps, and the leaps came from these like, scientists being able to find like this magical, finding. It was quite interesting, the argument, but it really made me start thinking a lot about like, okay, well, a lot of our profession is so-called based on science, but actually, do we know what that even is? Like, what is science? And more than anything, science is a process. It's not facts. It's not a bunch of facts written down on a piece of paper. And we know that it's a process because they keep getting updated. At one point we thought, all sorts of different things were useful, and now they're not. And so, how do you actually put that together, and what process do you go through? And I think, whilst philosophy sounds maybe a bit boring to people, I think when you start questioning, okay, well, what's my philosophy for arriving at a problem, or starting to go through that process, you actually then start to learn, okay, well, maybe I do have a process, maybe I don't. These are the things that I hold true to. These are the things that I don't hold true to. I think that was a bit of a revelation for me, even though, as I said, it fits into that philosophical slant that we probably don't talk about enough in our early education around these things. I feel like a lot of times we're so quick to want to just jump into the practicality of the, medical profession without thinking about, well, what are we doing here? And we're trying to solve health problems.
Yeah, it reflects to, like, whether you realize it or not, how you're indoctrinated into thinking. Because if you don't consider this problem, you're actually not considering your own thought process.
Yeah.
And that then, I think, feeds back to the problem I alluded to before of being too protocol driven. This one size fits all problem.
Like we talk about this a lot, but like, what's the issues with protocols, do you think? Like, why is it an issue to use a protocol? Because obviously that protocol being developed, or probably being tested with research to be effective at a certain level. Like, why do you think it's a problem?
It's a problem because you're not optimizing the outcomes for the individual. I think that's what it comes down to.
I think that's something that, and that probably reflects these ideas that we have about science, is like research studies and even collections of research studies, whether it be meta-analysis or systematic review. All that is a bunch of averages, and then they're comparing the averages and based on the average result of that cohort. And obviously those cohorts change, but like it's all based on averages. So when someone walks through, this door, and we're kind of like trying to give them the best outcome for them, are we better to do it on like, on average, this intervention works? I'll use a generic topic that most physios and stuff would probably know, but like, say isometrics for tendon pain. There's a number of studies that said that it has worked, and there's a number of studies that said it's not that effective. I think what's more important is, does it work for that person?
Yeah.
And that to me starts to put into question. It's not that science or a single study or multiple studies is right, wrong, indifferent. I think it's just that you have to start recognizing what a scientific research paper or research is. And it's literally a collection of averages, and you're trying to slowly create a picture of what's going on. And if those averages always consistently end up showing a similar thing, then you're getting close to understanding how that problem works.
Yeah. And I think when it comes to looking at applied research, context is everything.
Yeah.
So like the basic thing is looking at, say, inclusion, exclusion criteria. So I always think it's interesting when they consider
the exclusion criteria is like everything. And it's like one person in the whole world who can be part of this study.
It's funny you say that, because if you did actually go down that rabbit hole, you probably would get to a point where if you kept applying inclusion and exclusion criteria, it would obviously limit the amount of people that you get in the study. I think the other big element too is all research is controlled. Clinically, you don't really live or work in a controlled environment.
No.
There's a lot more openness in terms of like one intervention or potentially multiple interventions that you do, and also what that person does in their own life.
For the other 23 and a half hours of the day they don't see you.
Exactly.
Or the 6.5 days that they don't have anything to do with you. Like, what are they doing?
Yeah. So, well, this comes back to, again, thinking about what stems my thinking is what I see clinically, and seeing that following protocols typically doesn't yield always good results. So something must click straight away of going, well, why is it that perhaps it did work for someone, or it might actually work for a group of people?
Can I ask you a question then? Like, does that come from this underlying premise that I think a lot of us are being taught is evidence-based practice, right? And to me, like, it's a huge gripe of mine, and I know that you're probably going to laugh because I say this thing all the time, but like, I don't think most people know what evidence-based practice actually is, where it came from, or what the constituents of evidence-based practice are. I think most people just think it's just what is written in research papers.
Absolutely.
Particularly, as I said, like applied research papers.
Well, it's often too, like, this is where language is always important to consider, of going, well, is that evidence-based? And what they mean is there some high quality applied study to support that? And that actually isn't reflective of what evidence-based practice is.
Yeah. Well, we keep saying it's not this. Do you want to describe what it is for people?
Sure.
Or do you want me to describe what it is for people?
Well, I can start and you can add where you think is appropriate. But if you look at the original concept of evidence-based practice by Sackett, it's looking at research, clinical practice, and clinical experience, I should say, and then the patient values and expectations.
Yeah,
and we can further subdivide that because
and when Sackett proposed, I think it was in the early 90s, and he's a physician from Canada. He highlighted the fact that they were equally weighted.
Yeah, it's important to highlight.
I think that's the biggest issue. It's like now, I think people say, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. And like you learn about this maybe in one lecture in your medical course or dentistry or physio or osteo or whatever. But it's like it's 90 and then 5% for the clinical experience and, 90% for the research stuff, and then current body of evidence. And like, it's just not fair because it's not how it was proposed and it's not how it was intended to be utilized. But I don't know, and I know I'm exaggerating, but I think that's kind of how people sometimes try and apply. They go, well, there's no evidence for that. Well, what? You can't. Why are you doing that? Where did you get that from?
I think it's further exacerbated by at conferences, even like people who do podcasts in, say, sports medicine, high performance. They'll interview a researcher in a particular field.
Yeah, in the field, yeah.
And I'm not dismissing that researcher doesn't have knowledge. Clearly they do, and they have typically expertise in quite a refined field. And it's useful to be able to pick their brains. And it's useful to consider the research that they've done, whether it be applied primary or secondary research. The issue that comes with that, though, is thinking about, well, how do we apply that research to clinical practice? Because it isn't just simply a process of following the exact intervention from the study to real world.
Yeah.
And the other issue that can happen, you see a lot, is how much clinical experience does that researcher have? Because...
Well, like, it's interesting to say that, like a book that I've just finished, which is on more sports psychology stuff for anyone's interested. I quite enjoyed it. It was Elite Minds by Stan Beecham. But he asked a question about if you needed surgery, would you prefer the professor who has all the research background, has studied this type of intervention, this surgery, and his knowledge is based around all of the research they've done, the reading, the collaboration with other experts on that topic, on that surgery, but really doesn't perform surgery at all, never has, or the surgeon who's done hundreds of that operation at a high success rate, but doesn't read anything, and is too tired to do extra study when they go home because they're doing 10 surgeries plus a day. Like, which one would you choose? And it's pretty obvious that you choose the person with the surgical experience than the person who theoretically is more attuned to the research and the knowledge about that surgery, but really doesn't have the experience to carry it out.
Yeah. I think that's a good analogy, and it's very much highlighted too, because typically the amount of high quality applied studies looking at a particular intervention is pretty limited. And if you only follow what is the gold standard, you typically find that the outcomes you get are not always favorable. And I think you see that in the real world still, because we don't necessarily see zero hamstring injuries in elite sport, or no ACL injuries occurring. Now, we might see trends of improvement, which is good, but that's also a part of the process of thinking about how you update and change your thinking over time.
Yeah, and I think it reflects, something we spoke about slightly earlier, but we'll probably talk a lot more about, which is an area of interest for us, is complexity and complex systems and how that relates to healthcare. I think we'll try and get a few people on to discuss that more, because I think it will make more sense for people. But I think it reflects that it's a multifactorial situation, and you're dealing with a complex entity, complex behaviors. So therefore, to think that singular interventions or even a couple of interventions that address a few factors, say in hamstring injury or ACL, is going to address the total problem is probably pretty naive.
Yes, and like for anyone who works with, particularly in athletic populations, you start to see that pretty quickly, where more often than not you have to come up with novel solutions to find a solution for that particular problem. Yeah,
and that's where that ability to take what you've got in terms of evidence and then experiment and try and come up with as I said, some novel kind of interventions is helpful. We've gone pretty well here. We're already up to nearly 30 minutes.
Do you reckon people will listen to this point?
No, they're probably gone already. So that's okay. We can start doing whatever we like at this stage. What we might do is a segment that we're going to consistently have in, and obviously we'll start it this week, but is going to be based off the question, what is something interesting that you've read this week? And so Jack, being our sort of resident education person here at MAD, I think I'm going to be asking this question of him a lot more than he's going to be asking it of me. But to start off, what's something interesting that you've read this week, Jack?
Well, as I was briefly mentioning to you before, John, I came across this article a while ago that I wanted to do a review on, and I was looking at the adaptations of chronic stretching to muscle performance. And
it's such a controversial topic. Even recently this week, do you remember we had a patient in this week where the patient asked the question, and they're an athlete, they asked the question about, should I stretch before I go to do some training? And they're a pole vaulter, actually. And we sort of laughed because we get asked this question a lot. There is this it seems deep-rooted now almost.
Absolutely.
Within performance and exercise science, teaching and coaching even, like for those who know, I'm involved heavily in coaching track and field, and it's pretty strongly entrenched in some circles that stretching reduces performance output. Now, there are studies that say that, but it was very, very funny when he asked about it, because he said, do you want to have this discussion? And he was like, yeah. And he said, if you read those studies, the methodology is extremely flawed.
It's actually a good example of talking about evidence-based practice with Guru 4, because the first thing we have to consider is, again, the context of the study. Because as you alluded to, there actually are a lot of studies of looking at acute stretching in a warm-up and subsequent performance. And this is what's, I think, led to a lot of this embedded belief in both sports medicine and high performance about stretching being bad. And there's a typical study methodology that's followed where they get a group of people who have usually never done stretching before, and they get them to do stretching, typically static stretching, where they'll hold a stretch, and sometimes this stretch they're holding for 5, 10, even like up to 15 minutes. And they might be doing, say, 15, 30 minutes of just static stretching. Following that, so they're not doing any other type of warm-up, they get them to do some performance measure. So typically it's jump, sprint task.
Which you would just never do that. Like, as a coach, that's ridiculous. I would never say to my athlete, stretch, all right, now go and do a sprint.
Well, and this is where we need...
That would actually, it would be part of, as you've spoken about before, like an integrated warm-up. Well, they'll do some stretching, then they'll do some, some drills, they'll do some running stuff. Then they'll slowly be building the intensity so that their system is getting ready to be able to carry out a sprint. They're not just going straight into stretching, straight into sprinting. It just doesn't make any sense. So why are they designing these studies like this?
That's a good question. But it highlights straight away where you need to, someone who is considering what they're reading to go, hang on a sec, this doesn't make sense. Like, since when do you get someone to do static stretching early for a prolonged period as a part of the only thing of the warm-up? That just simply doesn't happen. What amazes me is there is study after study which has simply replicated that methodology where it's just this prolonged static stretching.
Did you ever finish that review that you did of that review?
No.
For our listeners, Jack started a literature review.
It was actually a systematic review.
Compiling evidence around this kind of topic. And you actually had a lot of work put into it.
Look, I did. That was a good experience.
You're going to have to publish that at some point.
That was a good experience. It made me realize that I'm not a researcher.
We'll have to ask one of the researchers that comes in. We've got a few people lined up that are colleagues of ours, whether they're willing to publish it for you and help you get it finished. Because I think it's an important piece of information.
True.
It shouldn't just sit there because you're not that far off finishing it.
Yeah, that's true.
You've done the hard part, which is weeding out most of the studies and things.
Well, the next part though is putting in like all the data and things like that.
Yeah, but you get a statistical freak to sort that out. To get a statistician there's plenty at Lateral where you worked it.
No, I think most of them actually end up because they, like all the researchers there, learn basic stats.
You can handle that. You know that. That's it's optimizing your own performance, mate. You bring in people in the team that help you.
I'm not sure there's going to be anyone at Lateral going, wait, who are you? You haven't published any research before. Why am I going to help you out? But like, it's important to illustrate that point because thinking about how acute stretching or how stretching has a negative connotation associated with it, a lot of it is related to that. Now, we can talk more about this another time, but it's useful to highlight that when they've done high quality studies where the methodology is included your typical warm-up, so like typically some submaximal jog, a little bit of stretching, which could be static or dynamic, and then your sport-specific warm-up, you see that subsequent performance is either not affected.
Have they also done studies like where it's static versus dynamic, but with the exact same sort of integrated warm-up? Have you seen those? Is there anything that you've seen with that? Because that, I think, will be the question people will bring up. They'll go, well, you can say that, but I still think dynamic's better. All else being equal, you do the same warm-up routine, and in the mobility or stretching flexibility component, there's static versus dynamic.
Yeah, look, I think that comes down to then, well, how long are you doing the static stretching for? Because most of the time it's going to be pretty short.
Yeah. Well, you think about that. You watch athletes and they stretch. They hold it for about 7 seconds. Yeah. Is like the maximum. People go, oh, yeah, they were doing static stretches. Like, they were kind of just, toying with the end range that they've got. We'll talk about this another time because obviously this is an area of real interest for you, Jack, like about what the mechanisms are around flexibility and stretching and where if you get improvement, what's actually improving, whether it's tissue elongation, is it at a tissue level? Is it at a central level? We'll talk about that more another time. But that would be the study that I think would be interesting, is like keep it all equal, but static versus dynamic. Does it actually make a difference?
I'm not sure if they've, off the top of my head, I can't think about whether
I don't think it would, to be honest with you.
Yeah. This is where it comes back to an individual level. If someone said to me, look, I find dynamic stretching more useful in a warm-up, great. I've got no issue with that whatsoever.
Yeah.
I typically think that static stretching is useful in a warm-up, particularly in a rehab setting or where someone's got a particular deficit, where, like they're coming back from surgery and they're coming back from a soft tissue strain, they've got a reduction in flexibility, that you can see evidently when they do static stretching and then you look at their performance, you see improvements in their biomechanics, in their output. Yeah. So again, this will probably be a topic for discussion at another point. We've discussed a lot about the application of static stretching to different athletes, and we've seen very different outcomes in their performance measures. And you have to be considerate of that. Some people can tolerate a lot more static stretching than others. I find. But,
we've gone completely off topic. What was the paper that you
Well, it's good to give that context. And with this particular systematic review, they were looking at chronic stretching on muscle performance. And when I say chronic stretching, it's looking at doing stretching over a long period of time, so usually over 5 to 10 weeks. And it's looking at doing stretching as its own training intervention. So this is not as a part of a warm-up. This is like post-training or as a separate training.
This is what you set up.
Yes, and
that's what you're doing at that time.
Yeah, and that's important to highlight, because if you're going to do static stretching or prolonged static stretching, for which there's benefits to do that, we can talk about that now or another time, you do want to think about doing that separately. And that makes a lot of sense, because for an athlete, the most important part of their training is sport specific. Yeah. And then they may do other adjunct training, whether it's resistance training, flexibility, and so on. But anyway, going back to the study, what they found was typically when you look at chronic stretching over time, typically was looking at static stretching, you see improvements in a lot of muscle performance.
Okay. So if you continue to do, to play it out, if you're doing it often enough and your body is adapting to it, you are getting a benefit.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There are some studies that didn't show that, and it's interesting to look at those individual studies where they didn't see an improvement in performance. Some examples would be like looking at, say, stretch shortening cycle, doing things like counter movement jump as a good example. There are studies showing improvement in performance from chronic stretching over time. There are studies that show essentially a neutral effect. You can start to see the disparities in the studies though when you think about, well, what are the muscle groups that they stretch? And like, for instance, I know that there was a few studies with looking at counter movement jump where they didn't look at, say, stretching the quads, which, when you think about a counter movement jump, is very important.
There's a good contribution from the quads. You're not going to do it without quads.
And then this is, again, something we'll talk about at another point. We need to look at the specific variables associated with stretching. And that in itself is an important discussion to have. So think about it with regards to resistance training. We know that there's clear differences based on the volume, when you think about sets, reps, the frequency, the intensity, the type of resistance training, and the list goes on. We don't really talk about that much in stretching.
It seems weird to go like, okay, well, I'm going to prescribe stretching and I want you to do 4 sets for 30 seconds per set or 3 minutes per set or whatever it is. And I want like my total, and, even think about almost like periodizing the stretching and being like, okay, across 4 weeks, I want to see you get to 12 minutes of total stretching hold time. Like, you don't think like that. Why do you think that is?
A big part of it, I think, is the issue where, again, a lot of people don't do stretching because of the poor studies that are done. And
well, actually, here's an even question that goes even further back, because I've heard dumb discussions about this of like the range of motion is not important. Right?
Yeah.
And like you laugh, and like I probably laugh too, but like,
well, I actually laugh at that question because you say it's not important to what? Like, what are you referring to?
Well, like you see in some sports performance settings, you see it in some physio settings. People say, oh, well, like say a distance runner can't touch their toes, and they go, oh, well, that doesn't matter. A lot of distance runners can't touch their toes, right? The question I have for you, and I think this is something that we discussed, but why is it important? A lot of them get away with it. So clearly, it's not having at least an external, observable, detrimental effect. So why is range of motion, and particularly flexibility, for instance, in a stretching setting, useful? Like, why is it a trait you want?
Well, I actually think that's an important thing to highlight. You don't have to do stretching. It's not like it's something that you must do, otherwise you fall apart.
And I guess the same goes for other
resistance training. Another great example.
Like, there's, say, for distance runners, there's a lot of them that don't ever lift weights. They don't ever do any strength training. They just run, and their performance is good.
Well, this comes back to thinking about how do we optimize outcomes for individuals. So we can think about this very simply. One thing is there a flexibility deficit that you identify? If so, what are interventions that you can use? Well, we know that stretching is typically the most useful one. When you do that, do you see changes in the mechanics of their movement? Do you see changes in their recovery? Because
I think that's the important thing of, like, when you identify those deficits, is there a mechanical limitation, potentially, say, around range of motion that you want to address because you think, like, I think it's one of those things, maybe you don't need to touch certain things. But the reason that you do is because you're seeing, okay, I'm not seeing a performance outcome, or I'm not seeing, I'm seeing an injury chain that keeps cropping up, or is a similar thing. And I think it's related to a lack of range of motion, mobility, joint range, tissue length, capability in an area. I think that's an important thing. And one of the things that I always think about, because I tend to be a little bit more attracted to, say, like, biomechanics, is like the idea of, like, degrees of freedom.
Yes.
And so when you have more range, you have more degrees of freedom to be able to play with and experiment with. And if you look at it from a skill perspective, you look at, like, the work of, say, like, Bernstein. And I always remember that really cool image I think they took of someone, like, hammering something, like an expert, or a tradesman basically, hammering something. And the arc that they went through each time was slightly different, but the outcome was always the same. So, and to me, expert, or it's not even to me, it's to lots of people, I think, and we always see this, but, like, what experts are good at is not completing the same movement over and over and over. It's having the ability to get a similar outcome, but being able to manipulate and have variability in that
and
performance.
Complexity in movement. Something we talked about recently. Yeah, absolutely. I
think that's why it's helpful to have more range, is you've got more options in how you move.
Yeah, definitely. I think it depends on the particular task. Because, like, a distance runner is going to be very different to, say, a gymnast.
Yes.
And that's actually probably a good...
that's probably why they can get away with it, because the variability in the type of action they need to create is less.
Yeah.
And the same goes with even, I know I'm jumping around topics here, but, like, you look at, say, the big spate of osteitis pubis type injuries that we had late 2000s, early 2010s in AFL football populations. And a lot of it, people were suggesting it was heavily related to the drought period in Victoria, and there was, hard grounds. I think that was definitely a factor for sure. But one of the key findings that came out of it is hip range of motion was a big risk factor. And then we've had this now traverse into the world of femoroacetabular impingement, and everyone's like, oh, we've got to check that. And as time's gone on, we found, okay, well, pretty much everyone who's played field sports has, a cam or a pincer lesion. So you could just be cutting everyone open if you wanted to. But range of motion around your hips is important, particularly when you do a sport that is 3D, multidirectional. So if you don't have that, you're probably giving yourself limitations that you don't need. Whereas if you are in a sport like distance running, where you're literally running in a straight line, it's probably not going to limit you as much. And I think thinking about this and how many degrees of freedom you need is probably part of the equation for working out whether it's a deficit or it's not a deficit, or it's going to be a limiter or not a limiter. Yeah.
I actually think it's also worth quickly highlighting too, because you'll often hear this from a lot of distance runners, that there is a correlation between passive stiffness.
Yeah, this is a big topic. I don't know if we'll get too much of it. You can explain it for people.
Well, I'll explain it very simply, and perhaps we can go into the detail another time. But there is a correlation between passive stiffness and performance in elite distance runners. The issue then is that correlation versus causation. Because what we do know is, and this is when you do things like running, resistance training, any like high intensity physical activity, one of the byproducts you're going to develop is passive stiffness.
Yeah.
And that's actually becomes problematic. We see in a lot of athletes because it limits their movement capacity.
Yeah.
And like you're saying before,
we say passive stiffness. We're talking about like, the common reference you get from people is like, oh, my tissue feels tight, feels sore, it feels limited.
Yes.
It's that feeling that you get post first few resistance training sessions where you're like DOMs, and then you feel like really stiff in your muscles and you're like, oh, I can't move. That's that feeling of passive stiffness being sort of accumulating.
And what's interesting to note with looking at those studies of passive stiffness and distance running performance is when you get distance runners to do stretching, you see a reduction in their passive stiffness. You don't see a reduction in their performance.
Yes. Okay.
The reason being is the stiffness that's more important for runners is their active stiffness.
Yeah, and that's their ability to control what their leg's doing on the ground.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is something that we know is very well correlated to many high-performance tasks when I think of, say, sprinting, jumping, or running economy for distance runners. So stretching helps mitigate the accumulation of passive stiffness that typically I see as a negative byproduct of a lot of training modalities, and it maintains a lot of good movement capacity in the person. I won't go into this detail, but the other thing I think we need to think about with stretching is not just the impact it has on your musculoskeletal system, but on other systemic factors. Because I think that's where you're going to get a lot of benefit of stretching within, say, distance runners.
Yeah, and that goes into those other things.
Let's not go down that rabbit hole now.
Alrighty, I think we've just ticked over 46 minutes, so I think that was pretty successful for a first attempt. We thank you very much if you've made it this far and you've actually listened to the whole thing. We're going to hopefully be putting up more and more of these. The first few, you'll probably notice maybe just Jack and I using over different topics. But
so please forgive us in advance.
Yeah, we apologise, but we will try and start getting some guests started sooner rather than later. Thank you for joining us.